researcher at Columbia University, and I work in Raphael Yusta's lab on coming up with measures of consciousness and emergence in the cortex. But I wear a few different hats, and I'm going to be putting on my philosophy hat this evening because I want to kind of get two particular goals kind of in view of everyone. The first of that is that I want to go over what's going on in contemporary philosophy of mind, the very latest. And our guest tonight, Hedda Hasselmerk, is perfect for this. She is also a postdoc, but at NYU in the philosophy department, and she works with such luminaries like David Chalmers, whose name some of you might know. Her PhD title was Panpsychism and Causation, a New Argument and a Solution to the Combination Problem. She is professionally impressive, but I think far more impressive is her willingness to engage in really deep problems, and she is, like me and a few others, kind of in pursuit of that ever-receding great white whale, a theory of consciousness. And it's going to be her and others like her who kind of define philosophy in the next few decades. So talking about contemporary philosophy of mind is the first goal. The second goal is actually a little bit more ambitious, and that's so that you all can kind of see what philosophers are doing in their ivory towers, and explore and see what they're doing. You have to understand how they think, and to understand how they think, you have to see them thinking. So Hedda's going to kind of propose a thesis, and then I'm going to kind of ask her some questions about it, and you'll be able to watch her think. Hopefully the exchange we had doesn't prove incomprehensible. I think this is a rare opportunity to question someone doing really deep work. So bear in mind that sometimes the macro flow of the conversation is going to be more important than the nitty-gritty micro details. The structure is that Hedda is going to present this kind of hot leading thesis in philosophy of mind, which is called Panpsychism, or some various forms of Russellian monism, and one that she herself works on. And then we're going to talk, and then we're going to take questions from the audience, which hopefully won't just be cries for clarity if we're successful. And with that, Hedda, please take it away.
Okay. Thank you, Erik, for a very kind introduction. Right, so I'm going to tell you about a pretty strange theory of consciousness that I myself endorse and just have done a lot of research on. So I'm going to introduce this theory as the solution to two different problems. First, the hard problem of consciousness, which I will start by explaining, and then what I call the hard problem of matter. One might think these problems have nothing to do with each other, but I'm going to suggest that they actually do. So the hard problem of consciousness is the problem of why or how consciousness arises from the brain. And by consciousness, I mean any kind of subjective experience, such as seeing red, or feeling hungry, or even having an idea or a thought. Any state that there is something that it's like to be in for a subject, or any state that feels like something at all. And most of our conscious experiences are quite complex and structured and involve abstract thought and reasoning. But in principle, conscious experiences can be very simple. So, for instance, just the experience of a single color, that's it would be a conscious experience. Science has given us very good reason to think consciousness depends entirely on the brain. So you've probably seen these pictures of brain scans, like fMRI brain scans, that show different kinds of brain activity. And it seems that all conscious experiences are accompanied by some kind of brain activity, like you see in these pictures. And for example, you can't ever have an experience of hunger without having a certain kind of brain activity, and you can't have that kind of brain activity without this experience of hunger. So conscious experiences and brain states, they seem completely dependent on each other. So the hard problem of consciousness is then the problem of why some brain processes are accompanied by conscious experiences at all. then no experience to go along with it. And neuroscience seems to be giving us a better and better map of what kinds of conscious experiences go together with what kinds of brain processes or brain activity. And it might also be able to tell us something about what all brain processes that are correlated with our typical experiences have in common. For instance, that they integrate information, or that they broadcast a message in the brain, or things like that, that some new theories propose. But still, it seems that science can ultimately only tell us that conscious experiences are correlated with certain kinds of brain activity, and not really why. So that's why we need to turn to philosophy. And in philosophy, there are two main theories of consciousness that give different answers to the hard problem. And I don't agree with any of these theories, but I will just describe them so that I can convince you that we need an alternative, namely a third theory, which I will get to later. So the first, most popular theory in philosophy of mind is Physicalism, which basically says that conscious experiences depend on brain processes because they just are brain processes. So if you look at those things in the brain scan pictures, you are the thing that you see there, that's really all there is. That's the whole experience. At least potentially, if we got this brain scan exactly right, and the picture could sort of capture every physical detail of what's going on in the brain. Maybe you can't capture that in a picture in principle, but at least some sort of representation. The basic problem with the physicalism is that conscious experiences, they just seem to involve more than brain processes, as physics and neuroscience can describe them. So even if I showed you a perfect picture of my brain state right now that included absolutely every physical detail, then it seems this would still not have captured what it's like to be me right now. So this seems to be an extra fact that any physical description leaves out. And most physicalists seem to agree that consciousness at least seems to involve something more than physical properties. But many of them claim that this is really because we think about our own consciousness in a slightly confused way, so that we get the illusion that it involves something more than physical properties. So when we think about our own conscious experiences in terms of how they feel, instead of in terms of their physical properties, then we are sort of doing a little involuntary trick, so that we trick ourselves into thinking that they involve more than the physical. But it's quite hard to believe that it's just an illusion, that conscious experiences involve more than just brain processes, as physics and neuroscience describe them. At least I find that quite hard to believe, so it's at least worth looking at other alternatives that might lead us to not having to say that there is such an illusion. So one such view is dualism. That's the second most popular view in philosophy of mind, which says that consciousness is not physical. So the brain scan picture is potentially, it's not a picture of an experience, but it's the picture of the cause of an experience. So in response to the hard problem, how and why do conscious experiences arise from brain processes, they say that they are connected as cause and effect. But then the question just becomes like, why are they connected as cause and effect? And it seems the dualist will end up having to say that there is some fundamental law of nature, just similar to the fundamental law of gravity, that just says that with certain kinds of physical states, we just get conscious experiences. One problem with dualism is that it seems to make consciousness entirely powerless, or epiphenomenal, which is the technical term. Because according to science, there's really no sign of any sort of non-physical influences on the brain or the body. the brain seems to be made of the same physical stuff as everything else, the same kind of atoms as everything else in the universe. And these atoms seem to be governed by the same laws of nature when they're inside the brain as they are when they're outside the brain. So if there is a law that says non-physical consciousness is produced by the brain, it seems this law could only go one way. So we could say that certain physical states produce and affect consciousness, but consciousness then doesn't affect the brain in return. So this means that dualism might have to say that it's an illusion that my conscious experiences affect my physical behavior at all via affecting my brain. And I find that very hard to believe too. So right now it clearly feels like my thoughts are causing me to say these words, and that my feeling of being very frustrated with dualism is causing me to try and pick up problems with it, and so on. So I find this view quite unsatisfactory too. But for a long time, the debate in at least mainstream philosophy of mind has been going back and forth between dualism and physicalism and different versions of these views. But some philosophers have suggested that there might be more alternatives. So there always have been philosophers who have had different kinds of alternative views, but recently a certain kind of alternative view has started to get more and more attention, even within mainstream philosophy of mind, thanks to a lot of it thanks to philosophers such as Thomas Nagel, David Chalmers, and Gil Strawson, some of you might know. So they have suggested that maybe the source of the hard problem is not that we have some deep illusion about the nature of consciousness, such that the illusion that it's somehow special and not capturable in physical terms, or that it's an illusion that it affects physical behavior at all. Maybe the real source of the hard problem is that we are making the wrong assumptions about the nature of physical matter. So usually we think that, at least in principle, physics can tell us everything that there is to know about physical matter and the stuff that our brain processes are made of. So matter is made of particles, and the particles have properties like mass, charge, spin, and so on. These might not be all the properties, and future physics might discover more properties, but there will be properties of this, roughly this kind, that physics tells us about. But there is reason to think that there must be more to matter than what physics tells us. Because it seems like physics only really tells us about what particles do, or what their structure is, and nothing really about how they are in and of themselves. Charge, for instance, if you ask a physicist what charge is, they would say that charge is the property of repelling other particles with the same charge and attracting other particles with opposite charge, or something like that, which is really just the way we relate into and behaving in relation to other particles. But then there's the property like mass, and mass is really just the property of resisting acceleration or attracting other things with mass, or maybe to space-time in some way. So that's also a relation or a kind of behavior that we see, not really an intrinsic property. And in general, it seems that fundamental physics is formulated almost entirely in terms of mathematics. And mathematics is a language that describes abstract structure and relations only. But then one might wonder how physical particles are, independently of what they do, or whether physical matter mustn't also have non-structural properties to realize the structure that is described by physics, or to give some kind of concrete content to these abstract mathematical forms. And this is what I call the hard problem of matter. And Stephen Hawking put it very nicely, to quote him, maybe a little loosely. He said, even if there is only one possible unified theory of physics, it's only a set of rules and equations. What is it that breathes fire into the equations and makes for a universe for them to describe? We might also put the problem in terms of another metaphor. So you could think that physical reality, or the aspect of physical reality that physics tells us about, is a bit like software. It's a kind of logical and mathematical structure. But this software needs some kind of hardware to implement it, if it is to exist really and concretely as opposed to just abstractly. So what can this hardware or fire be? This brings us then back to consciousness. Because unlike physical matter, consciousness does not seem purely structural. It has qualitative properties, such as what it's like to see red, what it's like to feel hungry, and maybe what it's like to have an idea or a thought. So these sorts of experiences, or qualia, as they're also known as, they might have some internal structure, but structure is not all that there is to them. It seems that we know something about what qualia are like in and of themselves, independently of how they just relate to other properties. And this suggests maybe that either that consciousness or some kind of stuff that's more like consciousness than any other property we know is really what breathes fire into the equations of the whole of physics. Or that consciousness or proto-consciousness is the hardware that the software described by physics runs on. And so this inverts a well-known idea from philosophy of mind, where it's often been suggested that the physical brain is like hardware, and the mind is like software. And the mind is software that sort of runs on the brain. But now this is turned around, because if you look at what physics tells us about the brain, we actually just find software or pure structure all the way down. And consciousness is actually more like hardware, because it has qualitative or non-structural intrinsic properties. So this view can be called dual aspect monism. It's also known as Russellian monism, after the philosopher Bertrand Russell, who once suggested it. So the idea is that reality consists of one kind of stuff. That's why it's monism and not dualism. But this stuff has two aspects. From the outside, it's physical and relational. And this is the aspect that physics talks about. But from the inside, it's somehow qualitative and then either conscious or proto-conscious. So the question is then, how does this solve the hard problem? The problem of why are brain processes accompanied by consciousness at all? There are some brain processes. So briefly, this dual aspect view says that this is because consciousness and physical properties are two aspects of one and the same process, the intrinsic aspect and the extrinsic or relational aspect. And given this view, we don't have to say that it's an illusion that consciousness is different from brain processes, as physics and neuroscience describes them, because neuroscience only describes one aspect, and consciousness is really a different aspect of these brain processes. But also, you don't have to say that consciousness is connected to brain processes via some kind of fundamental law of nature. That, so far as science indicates, can only go one way, so that consciousness is affected by the physical, but it does not affect it in return. Which is what the dualists might have to say. On this view, consciousness is absolutely essential to the brain, in the same way every structure needs some kind of non-structural content or realizer. Every outside needs an inside, or software needs hardware, or at least in a similar way. So these are not meant to be perfect analogies, but they're just serve as illustrations of the general idea. So in this way, this dual aspect monist view seems to avoid the bad consequences of both physicalism and dualism. But the problem, if you want to call it that, with the view, is that it entails a kind of panpsychism or pan-proto-psychism, which is the view that every physical thing, not just brains and other complex systems, are associated with either consciousness or something very like it, which is proto-consciousness. Because if the entire physical world is only structural, then all parts of the physical world needs a non-structural realizer or insight, such as consciousness. So you would have to say that even atoms might have a tiny bit of consciousness, or at least some kind of proto-consciousness, which is something many people find extremely impossible, that there might be something that is like to be a tiny particle. But you might think that it's, at least I think it might be ultimately more impossible that the apparently non-physical aspects of my own consciousness are just purely illusory, or that my conscious experiences don't influence my physical behavior at all, which might be the alternative you have to accept.
All right, thank you so much, Hedda, for that wonderfully quick, or as quick as these very, very complex kind of conceptual structures get, a rundown of Rousseauian monism, dual aspect. So first thing, I just want to ask a few clarifying questions so that everyone's on the same page. So in terms of when you're talking about consciousness, you're talking about subjectivity, this what it is like this. So in this view, for instance, you wouldn't need to be, say, a higher order species like us with self-awareness to be conscious, right? And in some sense, this implies a sort of continuum all the way down. Mm-hmm. Is that correct?
That's right. So there are certain features of our consciousness, or maybe of most human experience, that might not be essential to experience as such as, for instance, rationality, thinking. It's just this aspect that there's something that is like to be us that we might think we can share with simpler systems.
Right, and for instance, a dog might have consciousness but can't express it, and there's a sense in which you're kind of saying, or this thesis is kind of saying, well, maybe an atom has some very, very small form of consciousness which it also can't express.
Yeah.
Well, this is very interesting, and we'll kind of wend our way back here. But first, I want to kind of broaden this and ask a few questions about kind of the current state of philosophy. I myself am a neuroscientist, but my focus has been kind of explicitly, some might say wantonly, on consciousness. And, in neuroscience, this takes the form of something called the search for the neural correlates of consciousness, which was kind of described in saying even if you had this perfect map of the brain, we still need to kind of correlate the events in the brain to consciousness, right? But it's the key thing about it, and why it's been accepted by neuroscientists, or at least partially accepted by neuroscientists, is that it's metaphysically neutral, right? You're just saying, well, let's just correlate things in the brain to conscious or unconscious experiences, and there's something interesting about that we can learn. But this would never have happened in neuroscience even 15, 20 years ago. So there's been this big change. In terms of philosophy, in the last 40 to 50 years, has there been this kind of sea change, or has this been there all along, or what's kind of the current feeling in the field?
So it used to be in philosophy of mind that people were more interested in explaining things like thought, language, rationality, action, and all of these things that are very closely correlated with consciousness, but might not be absolutely essential to it. So you might have conscious experiences that don't have any of these features, like animals and small children, and maybe not all of our adult human experiences have all of these features either. But I think there's been a change in philosophy from focus on these particular, quite complex conscious phenomena to just consciousness as such, just the basic question of why does it feel like anything at all to have?
So a real orientation to this hard problem of consciousness.
Yeah, so that's been recognized that this is just a problem of its own that's distinct from all these other problems about particular conscious phenomena.
So I ask because I sometimes get this question, or at least in the sciences, you still run into kind of people who have a position that's maybe 60 or 70 years old, which was known as behaviorism. And psychology and even neuroscience started with really strong interest in consciousness. But that became suppressed historically through the rise of people like V.F. Skinner, who really pushed kind of behaviorism, which is the notion that humans are kind of just these black boxes that produce behaviors. There's nothing going on inside a particular person, there's just stimulus and response. So you still kind of run into this view. Often they don't call themselves behaviorists. Now sometimes the official term is an illusionism, or someone who thinks that consciousness doesn't kind of even exist. And so I guess my question is, what do you say to an illusionist in kind of your line of work?
So one thing you can say to, at least given like the behaviorist background, that as far as I understand it, behaviorism started out as just a methodological thing where you say we shouldn't worry about consciousness and just worry about behavior, but then it turned into behavior is all that exists. So if you have somebody who just denies that consciousness exists at all, which is one way of solving or dissolving the hard problem, I guess one reply to that is just to say that this is basically self-defeating, because if you have it clearly seems like to me that I'm conscious, so there is at least an illusion that there is consciousness. That if there is an illusion of consciousness, then an illusion is itself a conscious state. So if I admit that there is an illusion of consciousness, then we know that there is consciousness.
The kind of cognizant tautology.
But then you can also go a bit of a weaker reply, which is just that it seems just incredibly implausible that all of this is just an illusion. And at least to me, I feel much more certain that I am conscious than that, for instance, particles are not conscious. So even though it's sort of maybe logically possible that it's an illusion, it's something that I'm more certain about than a lot of other things that I could say.
Right, I found that it really breaks up into kind of scientists and philosophers will quickly kind of argue the point. I found the quickest way with scientists is to claim that they themselves are being philosophers in this. Because the scientist, of course, just goes by their own evidence, and I think by our own evidence, all of us are kind of conscious, right? And it's a phenomenon to be explained. Versus if you have some kind of metaphysical state where you need materialism or physicalism to be true, that leads you kind of by necessity to ending up denying consciousness. But I think it's more like Parmenides or Zeno, like denying motion, even the reality of motion, even though, of course, we have motion, right? But he's just kind of taken there by logical consequence. And so this kind of brings us to the question of what's the current relationship between scientists and philosophers, particularly working on consciousness, and particularly in the last 10, 15 years. Like, do you often, I know you talk to me, but do you often talk to scientists? Do you attend scientific conferences? So
I'm pretty interested in the basic hard problem that just is based on the fact that consciousness depends on the brain, and it doesn't make that much of a difference precisely how it depends on the brain. But then you have these sort of fundamental theories in neuroscience that say all brain processes that are correlated with consciousness have something in common, like the integrated information theory, which say that they're all at high levels of properly called integrated information. And there are also other proposals, and those things I try to keep up with because they can give you maybe some more basis to speculate from.
I found that a point of division kind of between even the scientists who are so interested in the philosophy of it and the philosophers, a point of division is kind of this notion of a philosophical zombie or P-zombie. Can you explain kind of what that is and then take us through a quick kind of walk through the thought experiment?
Right, so zombies are beings that are physically just like us, completely identical in every physical respect, except, well, not except, but they don't have any conscious experience. There's nothing that it's like to be them. That's the only difference.
And these beings are imaginary, in case anyone's
Yeah.
It's a thought experiment of these beings.
Yeah, so this has been used in philosophy as an argument against physicalism. And to simplify it a little, the argument says that it is conceivable that we have physical brain processes without any consciousness, or all of our physical properties without consciousness. That means that it's possible that we can, it's a controversial step, that there can be brain processes without consciousness, and that means that consciousness and physical processes can't be the same thing. That's a very influential argument, and which David Chalmers has done a lot to develop. So you might have there are sort of some obvious objections to this, that you can conceive of, for instance, that Citizen 4 is not Edward Snowden, for instance, but that doesn't mean that they're not the same person. But then you can modify and put certain conditions about what kinds of things this link between possibility and conceivability holds for, and arguably it holds for consciousness of the physical.
Yeah, for me, one of the issues has always been, again, kind of this conceivability. But I think one of the things is that it kind of relies on this notion that you can kind of conceptualize all possible theories of consciousness, given that we don't have one, kind of before you even have to. Basically, you can do that on a priori. Like you can do that before you even go in there and look. And I always thought that was a little bit weird because, of course, as David Hoel said, you have the knowns, you kind of have the unknowns, and then you kind of have the unknown unknowns. And there might be this kind of unknown theory of consciousness that the moment you or I or people who really care about this hear it, we would go, oh, I wish I had thought of that, sort of solve this 3,000-year-old problem. Are you sympathetic, or do you think that the zombie argument is very, very strong, very, very tight?
So, with respect to this dual aspect view that I prefer, the situation with the zombie argument is a bit different because, even though I would agree that if zombies are conceivable, that would mean physicalism is false. Given this dual aspect view, it might actually not be conceivable that zombies exist, because if you think that physical properties are purely structural, as I described, then if you are supposed to conceive of somebody who's physically just like me, but with no consciousness, then you are conceiving of a purely structural being, which, according to this argument I sketched, should not be possible, which is why we need consciousness. So, but this way of denying the zombie argument, or denying the first premise of the zombie argument, that is also an argument against physicalism.
You don't think it poses a very strong problem?
Yeah,
not a significant problem.
It doesn't support physicalism, but it's a way of replying to the argument that does not support physicalism, but it supports this dual aspect here.
As someone who does kind of investigate panpsychism, are you at all sympathetic to a view that a pretty famous philosopher named John Searle recently expressed in the New York Review of Books, where he said panpsychists think that consciousness is smeared out over the universe like jam, right? I mean, is that what panpsychists think? Do they think the universe is just toast and you kind of just...
Yeah, so this brings us to one of the...
He's getting up there, right? He's getting up there in years.
So this brings us to a problem that we didn't really, that I haven't mentioned yet, that I've kept a secret, which is that it seems that consciousness comes in units. So like, even though I have many different experiences right now, color and sound and different things, they still seem to be contained in sort of one single field of experience. And then you would think the same is true for other kinds of consciousness. It's not just jam. It's like an atom is conscious, but two atoms together might not be conscious. And maybe the chair is not conscious and has one big experience. It might just be a collection of particles with the tiny experiences. So So that's what panpsychists typically say, that
so this chair might be made up of like 10 billion tiny conscious experiences, all kind of instantiating some physical properties like the mass and shards.
Or you might want to say proto-conscious experiences if you don't want to make it sound too crazy, but something like that.
The proto is perfect because is it really sensible to talk about this notion of like a proto-consciousness? Like, of course, even our most simple conscious experiences are most pure, like the redness of red, or say overwhelming grief, right? So surely there's no atom going around, right, with overwhelming grief, right? Like so what is it conceivable that they have something very small that makes sense?
Yeah, so you would definitely want to say that the structure or the complexity of a physical thing sort of matches the structure or complexity of their experience. So you would want to say that a particle, if they have something like consciousness at all, it should be like maximally simple consciousness. And the question is, does that make sense? So you might have objections to say that consciousness can be maximally or have no structure. Basically, that's just like saying that the number 2 is angry, or it's just like a category mistake. So like one response to this is just to say that we can, so there's a famous philosophy paper by Thomas Nagel, which is called "What is it like to be a bat?" And then it says, there might be something that it is like to navigate by echolocation, but we can't really know what it is like. And then we do a kind of abstraction. We think that there might be something that is like to be something without having any idea what it is like. And I think we can do the same kind of abstraction and then get to this vague idea of a very simple form of consciousness, or maybe you should call it proto-consciousness, but I don't think there's any contradiction in that.
Right, so this is always so interesting to me because I love this notion of kind of how this kind of high-level philosophy is done, where you're kind of, okay, you're creating this logically coherent conceptual structure, and then you begin to notice the faults in it, and then you begin to say, well, how can I begin to repair the faults, right, and dig the correct ditches and so on, and build it up. And just because you don't always get a chance to kind of see exactly how kind of nitty-gritty and complicated this can get, we're going to briefly dive in and see exactly how difficult this is. So for instance, if you're starting with these proto-consciousness down here, now you need to build up to my own consciousness, you seem to run into this immediate problem where there's a finite, very limited set of whatever these proto-consciousness things are, and then how do you kind of recombine them all the way up? It seems like you need a whole giant theory about how that works.
Yeah, so now we're getting to what I was starting to indicate earlier, this what's called the combination problem, which is like, how do you get the kind of consciousness that we have and that we know from our own case, from putting together these like super simple experiences that you are supposed to find all the way down to the bottom level. And there is definitely something that's not obvious about that at all. So you might say, well, how do you get the complex brain from putting together just like all the basic particles defined in physics? But somehow that makes a little bit more sense than how you get the emotion from just proto-experiences.
But in some sense, like it's precisely that type of question that you actually are doing research in.
Yes.
Right? I mean, this is like an open question about how that could even work.
Yeah.
Right?
So my own point of view on this is, I think like what panpsychists should worry about the most is that this problem, how do you get human kind of experience from this sort of basic experience, that's just as hard as the original hard problem, which is how do you get consciousness from putting together particles that have no experience.
So it's like a hydra, you cut off one head, right, and now just as difficult problem has reared its head, and now so you have a sword of logic, and you need to cut through the different heads.
So it needs to show that you don't just get the regress, or that you're just like moving the problem around.
So that's perfect, because just to kind of cap this off with a few final questions, just to zoom out again a little bit. I mean, these are questions that people have kind of grappled with throughout history. And is there a tradition that you see yourself kind of belonging to, or philosopher that we'd be surprised to hear the name because we haven't heard it in a long time? Or?
So first of all, I just want to mention that I think there might be solutions to this combination problem, and I have some proposals that I won't go into here. So I don't think it's as hard as our problem. Right, so Panpsychism has a long history in both Western and Eastern philosophy. So many ancient philosophers were panpsychists. Giordano Bruno was a kind of panpsychist. It seems maybe Francis Bacon as well. And one very interesting historical panpsychist that influenced me a lot, or at least pan-proto-psychist, is Leibniz, who's also a well-known mathematician and logician. And he seems to be one of the first philosophers who had this dual aspect, or explicitly had this dual aspect or view that said physics only tells us about structure, but so we need to put something on the inside. And as I read him, Leibniz basically has all the main arguments that are now coming back in contemporary philosophy, so he was very ahead of his time.
Yeah, so
so this view is often called Russellian monism, but maybe it should be called Leibnizian panpsychism.
Leibnizian panpsychism.
But Leibniz also put a lot of other stuff in the mix that do not he had a lot of extravagant views.
And so just to end on kind of like a larger note, I was reading a little bit about Democritus, who's very, very, very ancient philosopher who talked, he kind of introduced this notion of just atoms and voids, and that was his ontology, right? Just little bits of matter floating around, and then void. And he wanted to introduce mind into it, but he couldn't find a place. And it sounded to me like he went through kind of some of these same arguments, right? Where he first starts thinking, well, why don't I just put mind in there, and then that doesn't seem to work, and then why don't I break it down? And then that also kind of doesn't seem to work, so now I'm forced to just kind of say, it's just atoms and voids. And given that I can kind of reference Democritus, and you think that maybe he, 2,500 years ago, struggled with some of these same notions, does that give you, does that kind of fill you with a terror that philosophers are kind of going through this endless, eternal return with all these ideas? Or does it give you hope in that we might be close to solving a 2.5 millennia problem?
It's definitely clear that we're struggling with many of the same problems that we've been struggling with for thousands of years, and as I just said, it seems like Leibniz has already had all the basic arguments that there is now a lot of new research on. So I don't know. I think like if we get some one thing that we don't find a lot about in history of philosophy is this combination problem. So that would there's a lot of interesting work being done on that nowadays. So that would be one way which you can progress potentially. Beyond just like going back to the same arguments. It's definitely kind of moving quite slowly.
All right, so perfect. Well, we will look out for that, and we will open it up for questions now. If there's a process for doing that, we've got about 10 minutes left. So if anyone would like to come forward or have a question, I can kind of hand off the mic to you. Yes, in the middle there. You can also just shout it if you...
Yes, sir. Are there any acceptable synonyms for the word consciousness?
Ooh, are there any acceptable synonyms for the word consciousness? How would you like to...
Yeah, so one term might be experience. But then there are two senses of the word experience. One is sort of learning about having experience with something, but then there is, subjective experience is one synonym. You always have to like specify in a technical term in philosophy is phenomenology. That's another term. Awareness. Awareness is a term, but that's also a bit controversial because that can sound kind of functional, because you could potentially be conscious without being aware of anything if you're dreaming or hallucinating, for instance. But in a certain sense, awareness can also be a synonym.
Yes.
So, when you were introducing the two and then the three different theories of consciousness, I was, so that's physicalism, dualism, and panpsychism. I was wondering where emergence would fit into there. So you have micro scale interactions, let's say particles, or of any kind of micro scale often can lead to different patterns at the macro scale. And it occurred to me, perhaps you put that in dualism. I'll let you respond, but I'll even want to go through my thinking. You might put that in dualism, in that you have this kind of micro scale interactions. That's where the real cause is, and then the macro scale is just epiphenomenal, but we can describe it. I always like to come back to thermodynamics and, let's say, temperature, where you have at the bottom particles interacting, but at the macro scale, if you have an aggregate of many atoms, you get things like temperature. Perhaps you can say temperature isn't real at the micro scale. You can't measure the temperature of an atom, and yet temperature is a very useful and very predictive notion. I mean, engines are built off of the rules of how temperature and pressure and volume interact, and you can write equations and vary and build things with that. Probably in a way that's much more reliable than atomic scale.
Yeah. So the question, in case people didn't fully hear that, is that there's this long discussed kind of notion of emergence, right? Which is that somehow you get something that's at a higher level or higher scale, that's doing something very different. And it seems like that's relevant here. For now, we're not just talking about matter, we're talking about kind of consciousness, and you start off with these tiny consciousnesses. Do they somehow can work together to create this larger, consciousness that emerges, and maybe that solves the combination problem?
Or maybe there is no consciousness at the bottom level, but it can occur at the top level.
Yeah, so there are definitely many, the term emergence can mean very many different things. So the basic idea of emergence is just that the whole can have a property that none of the parts have. For instance, you can have a liquid water without any liquid parts and so on. And that's, or you can have a chair that's made of parts that are not chairs. So it's like pretty trivial that there can be that kind of emergence. And but it doesn't seem like that's the kind of emergence we see with consciousness, at least. So most of the arguments against physicalism are aimed to show that this kind of emergence is not what can account for consciousness. And then there's this idea of strong emergence, which basically seems like dualism, where you need some kind of extra law of nature that says that things start working differently once you put them together in a certain way. So to me, it seems like emergentism is not really a distinct view. It's, depending on how you understand it, it collapses to either physicalism or dualism, and then it has to deal with the same arguments. But then, as Erik mentioned, you might have to say that there's a certain kind of emergence within panpsychism if you want to solve this combination problem. And then the challenge is to show that this emergence is sort of not as bad as the kind of emergence that you get with dualism. So that's definitely a challenge.
Good luck. Yes, another question. Whoever the mic is near.
Yeah. Just in the way you're talking about going from these small proto-conscious bits up to the fully conscious whole, I'm wondering if if you're interested in the origins of life. It seems like that was one time that already happened. We went from small bits to a whole over eons. So are you interested at all in why life emerged, or what those first molecules were doing? Is there anything about that moment that is of interest to you?
So this is an example that physicalists often use. They say it used to be completely unimaginable that you could get life from putting together lifeless parts, and then it turns out that now that makes complete sense. So why can't the same thing happen with consciousness? So one response to this is to say that, well, part of the reason why we managed to explain life in terms of non-living parts is that we start to understand life as a set of functions, such as metabolism, reproduction, and a couple more growth and things like that. And then then you can understand how sort of non-living parts can make mechanisms that perform these functions. But consciousness is different because the thing that makes consciousness hard is that it sort of involves more than just behavior or functions. It has these intrinsic qualitative properties. So therefore, this case of life should not really give us that much confidence that the same thing is possible for consciousness, or at least this is what many philosophers have argued in response to this objection.
But it would be the case that there would have to be something special about life, that it somehow, just from its extrinsic properties, somehow managed to put together these proto-experiences and build them up into kind of the larger macro-scale consciousnesses that we have. So sometimes evolution is kind of a long, in this view, it would be this long kind of like accumulation of getting all these little bits together until finally you have kind of full-blown consciousness that...
So do you mean with respect to the combination problem?
Yeah, exactly. Like evolution already kind of did the combination problem, if the view is true.
Yeah,
right.
So you might say that the kind of emergence that you see with the origins of life, that might not be sort of strong enough to parallel the emergence from of consciousness from non-consciousness, but it might be like similar to the kind of the way we can get complex consciousness from simple consciousness, or that would be like a nice thing for panpsychists. Then you would have to get into the details about what precise kind of emergence is this.
I think we have time for one or two more questions.
Hi. So just to disclaim, I'm not a neuroscientist, not a philosopher. I just get random.
Good.
So if the question seems a bit nonsensical or elementary, like, forgive me, because sometimes we just have random thoughts and the shower is good and we have not too many beers, right? So my question is, you had mentioned a while ago that every structural component must have some non-structural realizer. What did you mean by that?
There are some philosophers who defend this idea, who say that maybe physical reality is purely structural. Why do you need some realizer to the structure? Where did you get that idea? And then you might say that's just like very counterintuitive. But okay, so one thing that I like to say is that if you say that the physical is purely structural, then I can't really see the difference between physics and mathematics anymore. Because there has to be something that makes it true that some structures are physical structures and other structures are just mathematical, imaginary, or abstract structures. And then this idea of a realizer is sort of what makes the structure real. So that's one way of supporting this idea that structures need realizers in order to be real, in the sense that mathematics is not.
So maybe that would be like if I just took the laws of the universe and wrote them, out on a piece of paper. Okay, there's the information is there, and I can kind of derive all the relations from there, but nothing is doing the deriving of the relations. Like, what is that extra kind of act? Something happens.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. I think one more, maybe a quick question. We have.
Yes. My question is in reference to human consciousness. Assuming there's a unit of essence of human consciousness, are they the same in every human being? Or is there a study done on this topic?
Given this view I defend, then there are consciousness is just, I don't know, there's some continuum between all kinds of consciousness. So consciousness is just the kind of stuff that you find in different forms, and you don't sort of have any unique properties of individual minds in the same way. You don't find anything unique in an individual brain. So it gives a kind of continuity between all kinds of human experiences, but also all other kinds of experiences.
All right. First, I just want to thank Hannah so much for coming out and answering all these questions.